Hello, everybody. This is Nelson Virgil, founder of ExcelMale.com and discountinglabs.com. I'm very pleased today to have a big advocate for affordable access to not only hormone products, but all kinds of compounding products. And right now we're going through a really difficult time when it comes to attacks on access for all of us. From the compounding industry, FDA has been basically setting different rulings and upcoming potential issues that you all can get involved with right now. So Scott Brunner is, as I said, CEO of the Alliance for Pharmacy Compounding. He's gonna basically present what's keeping you so busy and what's keeping you up at night, which is a lot of work. So welcome, Scott, and please tell us a little bit about what you do and what the organization is trying to accomplish.
Well, thank you, Nelson. We appreciate very much this opportunity to talk and to share with the patient population some of the challenges that they are soon to be facing in their ability to access compounded medications, certainly compounded hormones, but really the range of compounded medications. We are a trade association. We are the voice for pharmacy compounding, and we represent not only compounding pharmacists and technicians, but also educators and prescribers, and yes, patients who benefit from compounded preparations. We have a consumer-facing website, patient-facing website at compounding.com. And really what we're spotlighting on that website is what we view as really the biggest challenge right now to patient access. And that is FDA's threat to base restrictions on compounded hormones on a, shall we say, discredited study that FDA itself commissioned from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. That report recommends across the board restrictions on compounded hormones, and yet the report itself only looks at 4 hormones out of the dozens that are out there. It's not very scientific, and based on a Freedom of Information Act request, we can demonstrate that the study was not at all independent the way FDA said it was, but that FDA interfered, manipulated, biased, there were conflicts of interest. FDA pretty much told NASM on the front end, we think these things are dangerous and this is what we want your study to say. And then recommended the people who would serve on the panel that created the report. FDA had a chance to review the report before it was finalized and offer its own input. So there was nothing independent about it. And our concern is that FDA will make good on this threat. It will introduce restrictions to compounded hormones that will deny millions of patients in this country, men, women, those in the transgender community whose lives are elevated. Their quality of life is elevated by these compounded hormone products. So that's the real threat right now, and that's where we're focusing the bulk of our attention.
Yeah, it's very concerning. I'm obviously a patient, also an advocate. I've obviously used HCG. I've used, obviously testosterone compounded creams, injections, you name it. There are lotions and creams. I also advocate for women's access to HRT. I have a 8,000 member group of women on Facebook called the Women's Health and HRT group, and they are really just freaking out with this threat. I even read, this is a big report. I mean, there's a soft cover. You can also, it's an open, it's public. You can actually find it online, but it's a thick report that, like you said, it was commissioned by the FDA. It's called the NASM report, and when you look at it, it looks scientific, it has references and all that, but there are very strong biases against compounding. And tell me, Scott, why this attack? What's the interest of shutting down affordable and customized access to products that we've been using for what, 30, 40 years? I don't know. Compounding it's an old industry, right?
Yeah, well, at least a half century or more. These hormones have been compounded. FDA has demonstrated a long antipathy, shall we say, against compounded hormones in particular. I think many would assert against compounding in general, but certainly against hormones. And one of the reasons they commissioned this report, we believe, was to give them cover in formalizing some sort of restrictions. It's frankly stunning, the bias and the manipulation that we see in this report, because if they wanted to introduce restrictions, an agency like FDA, you would think, would be prone to follow the science. There's nothing terribly scientific at all about this report. So again, it proposes across the board restrictions on all compounded hormones. In other words, patients couldn't access them, pharmacists couldn't compound them across the board. If FDA were to take that recommendation, they would likely do that by adding to, and I hate to be technical here, but there's a list that FDA keeps, and it is the demonstrably difficult to compound list. And once FDA puts a substance on the demonstrably difficult to compound list, it can't be compounded. And so what we're hearing from FDA and the rumor mill is that they are contemplating that sort of move. But again, this quote study, this report, I prefer to think of it as a report than a study. This report is limited to only 4 hormones, and none of the 4 are among the most prescribed hormone products out there. So you have a federal agency recommending across the board restrictions based on a report, and again, I should say potentially recommending across the board restrictions based on a report that only covers 4 hormones, and those aren't even the ones that are the most widely used and prescribed. Now, in FDA's defense, I do not think this is some evil scheme. I think these are well-intentioned people who happen to be wrong, and I believe that their own biases against compounding and compounded hormones are getting in the way of their ability to actually look at the real science. One of the problems we have with compounded hormone products, it's not like an FDA manufactured hormone product or any other FDA manufactured product that has gone through good manufacturing processes. It's FDA approved. There have been research study after research study after research study on each of those individual FDA manufactured drugs. You can't do that with compounded medications. There are literally thousands of formulations of hormones alone. And so just the cost to do a double-blind placebo, research study on that would just be prohibitive. And yet FDA says they want to see that kind of data before they're willing to not place restrictions on these hormone products. Well, we don't have that kind of data. I think it's going to be practically impossible to get that kind of data. But what we do have, what compounders across the country have been collecting, many of them, and many are beginning to collect, is patient-reported outcomes. How the patient says a compounded therapy makes them feel, how it improves their lives, or perhaps not, ought to matter in this discussion. And the NASM report, the little book, or big book that you held up a minute ago, doesn't think at all about the patient. And so what we're urging FDA to do is to slow down. We are working to collect patient-reported outcomes data on their compounded hormone therapies. And let's look at that data from patients themselves and see what we can discern about the effectiveness of these therapies. We're hopeful that FDA will listen, but frankly, their track record is, the agency can be sort of bullheaded when it gets something in mind. And so this campaign that we have launched, the campaign to save compounded hormones, you'll find abundant information about it at compounding.com, is an effort to engage patients who have benefited from these therapies, prescribers who prescribe compounded hormones, in telling us their story. So there's a place at compounding.com where you can leave a testimonial. It can be written, it can be a video testimonial. You can upload a document if you want. And then to share that story with your members of Congress. Because we believe ultimately the way to slow FDA down is for these constituents to reach out to their elected official in Congress and for the member of Congress to weigh in with FDA, maybe pound on them a little bit to take care and mind the science and pay attention to patient outcomes. So that's really the ask right now. We need patients to go to compounding.com to leave their testimonial. And you don't have to leave a testimonial, but it would be great if you did. There are already thousands there from every state in the union. And then to share a message with your member of Congress, urging them to urge the agency to go slow and base anything they do on genuine science and not on this trumped up report that they commissioned and manipulated.
Yeah, and it's something else I want to make clear is that people think this is only going to affect women, like HRT products for women. This 11, I counted 11, maybe I'm wrong, of the difficult to compound list, 11 hormones. I mean, affect all of us, men, women, transgender community, all of them. So that's something I want to make sure people understand, because I think in the last few months, it's been this belief that only women are going to be affected. Obviously, women have a lot more customized HRT creams and injections and pellets and all that, but obviously it's going to affect men and women. And what does this mean, Scott? Not only the access to the customized blends of different hormones for the particular patient, but obviously without compounding, cost access is lower, cost is higher, because we would have to go for pharmaceutical brands at a regular pharmacy and have to deal with the big prices there. For me as a patient, pricing has been an issue. Obviously, all of us are trying to find a way to support our health and not go broke in the process, which is difficult in this country. And so I'm very concerned, not only because people think, well, there's testosterone that you can get from a pharmaceutical company, or there is, estrogen from another pharmaceutical company. But I went through a list of the pharma brands, brand names versus the compounding. And like you said, there are thousands. And this is going to have a big impact. Something else I wanted to add, the FDA per se, and I come from a strong background on the FDA advocacy because I come from the HIV world. I was, or I am still an HIV activist, research activist. So we have a very good relationship. And it was basically the drug side of the FDA. It was obviously the biologics side, the drug side, but the drug side was always very hypersensitive to the patient needs. And we, believe it or not, had a good relationship. Obviously, there was a little fear there that we have to install. But I think what we need to do now in compounding all the patients, we have to have that urgency. Obviously, in AIDS, we have life and death situations. And in many cases, in compounding access, we have life and death situations. There are people that would be impacted. I know women and men that have been depressed, sexual function, no fertility, suicidal, you name it. And they have been saved by this compounded product. So this is for me, that's why I think I'm as concerned, because it reminds me, it gives me PTSD from those years that we had to fight for our lives back in the days with AIDS. So I think that there can be a relationship with FDA, that patients have as long as we raise the awareness that they know they're human beings beyond this, unreasonable demands that they may be making. And let's make sure people understand this has not happened yet. This report came out, in 2020, right? So right. They've been sitting on it since then. COVID came. Obviously, everybody at the FDA has been busy with COVID. COVID is now obviously, I'm not saying getting better, but we're not in a crisis mode we used to be. So my concern is 2 years later, maybe now, the time is. So it is a lot easier as an activist to come from a preemptive side of things before things actually happen. And that's why it's so critical. People think, well, nothing's happened yet, so we can. No, this is a perfect time to send your email to Congress and the FDA. I also created a website called hormoneaccesscoalition.org, not to, what you guys are doing is perfect, but you come from, obviously, the trade association and the compounding pharmacy industry. I believe that there had to be a patient group that was working, on the same issues from the patient side, because obviously that's what we did in my world back in the days. So people can go to hormoneaccesscoalition.org, and also there's some petitions there and all that. But anyways, just wanted to make sure people understood, A, this hasn't happened, but it may anytime. B, we can do something about it. Not just, people complain online a lot. I say, no, don't complain. Here's a link to company.com. Just send your, will that be useful? That's another question people say. How can we go against a government agency? I said, well, maybe I'm naive, but in my world, back in the days, we were effective in getting what we needed. So it is about raising awareness. I mean, I think the FDA is human beings like we are. They're not, I really don't think, well, maybe I'm naive, that they really are trying to shut down. They're concerned about safety. So is compounding the industry as a whole, is that a less safe industry than the pharmaceutical manufacturing? Tell us a little bit about that. That's the first question you get from my audience,
Sure. Okay. So just a quick primer. Compounded preparations have a statutory and rightful place in the American drug supply chain, the American healthcare system. FDA prefers, as you would expect them to do, FDA-approved drugs that have been mass-produced, but they've gone through these clinical trials, they follow good manufacturing practices, et cetera. And if you're a prescriber, your first choice of a therapy for a patient should be an FDA-manufactured drug. But not every FDA-manufactured drug comes in a dosage form or a strength that is right for every patient. And that's where compounding comes in. So FDA is rightfully concerned about safety. And yet they always remind in all their public statements, compounded drugs aren't FDA approved. And the insinuation, and sometimes it's more than an insinuation, is that because a compounded preparation is not FDA approved, it is therefore unsafe. Well, that's a logical fallacy, because the the standards of the US Pharmacopoeia, FDA regs, State Board of Pharmacy laws and regulations all come into play in regulating the practice of pharmacy and pharmacy compounding. So while each individual compounded preparation may not be FDA approved, I can guarantee you it comes from a pharmacy that's been inspected by the State Board of Pharmacy, and in many instances by the FDA itself. Those materials, the active pharmaceutical ingredient, et cetera, are coming from suppliers whose facilities have been inspected regularly by FDA. And every single one of those pharmacies adheres to what are basically uniform standards of practice from the US Pharmacopoeia, chapter 795, 797, sorry to be so technical about it, but these are standards that all the states adopt and require that compounders adhere to. And so while they're not FDA approved, that does not mean they are unsafe. And think about it. I think I would be the first to say that tragedies like the New England Compounding Center situation, it was criminal. And yet compounders work across the country, thousands of them day in and day out, and make differences in the lives of patients, and the patients' conditions are improved because of those therapies. And so our members are serving patients who have a legitimate need for a customized medication. And that's what we do. And we think, we like to say our members compound the joy of living for patients. That's what we're trying to do, because those patients are not well served by FDA manufactured drugs.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that was a good clarification. Okay, well, I think since we have we have three issues that we're going to cover, because I just want to tell the audience, this is not the only issue. There is more, like the commercials sometimes on TV. Wait, there is more. Let's talk a little bit about the issue with biologics, with HCG and all that. The Biologics Price Competition and Innovation Act was created to increase competition and probably improve pricing of biologics. And that did completely the opposite when it comes to compounded HCG and gonadotropins like that. So let's talk about that, since that's current, that's already happened. And there is actually a shortage of HCG, and the price is going up of like crazy right now. So let's talk about that, since a lot of people, men and women, that use HCG for fertility purposes are really going through a shock right now and emailing me a lot on the issue. So what's happened there?
And even beyond the fertility issue that you mentioned, children with autism patients are having difficulty accessing what they need. So the legislation that you mentioned was passed over 10 years ago, which is interesting. So there was a 10-year period before it actually took effect, and it basically reclassified a number of substances as biologics. Well, a biologic is, and I won't get too technical on you, but it's a different substance altogether, regulated by a different part of FDA. And so in March 2020, when the legislation took effect, suddenly a number of substances that our pharmacy compounders have been able to compound for years were now out of reach. They were reclassified as biologics, and the only entities that could compound them were entities that have a biologics license. And just so that you'll understand, a biologics license is a pretty high bar, incredibly expensive to get. Not many, your local hometown compounding pharmacy just isn't going to have that. Well, the interesting thing about that legislation is that it was largely initially focused on some abuses that we were seeing in the marketplace related to insulins. But because HCG fell into that same category, it was swept up in the legislation and reclassified. And so as of March 2020, nobody can compound HCG, and all the downstream effects that you have mentioned have resulted. There are a number of challenges, and I will admit, on this issue, among all the issues that we're dealing with, this one is the one I'm least hopeful about, because number one, it is in law. And so there are really only two paths for changing it. One is to change the law. We have looked strategically at that path and do not believe there is any reasonable chance of passage. Big Pharma would certainly oppose such a move. We just don't see a way forward, and would sort of be banging our heads against the wall if we attempted that. The other path is for FDA to use enforcement discretion, which is something that they do in a lot of different ways related to compounding and other things too, which would basically say, yeah, we're going to enforce the law as it relates to this biologics reclassification, but related to HCG, we would take a different path, and that could take any of a number of shades in the way they could do that. We have not seen any indication, and we've joined with the Outsourcing Facilities Association in meeting with FDA about this issue, and just are not getting any indication that they might be inclined to utilize enforcement discretion. And again, I don't mean to sound like a conspiracy theorist, because I do think the people at FDA are largely well-intentioned, but I also think there's a mindset there that FDA employees want to do what they can to marginalize compounding in general. And so if you have a mindset, compounding dangerous, marginalize it, then there's no incentive for the agency to think about enforcement discretion on this issue. So if I sound like a downer on this, I'm sorry. I just don't see a way forward. We do know that a handful, I guess, of pharmacy compounders are joining together to try to gather research. FDA is moved by science, as we've said, or in most cases they are, and they want to see demonstrated patient harm as a result of this action. And so we are working in Power Pharmacy out of Houston. One of our members is really leading the charge on this to develop data that would demonstrate patient harm as a result of this classification, inadvertent patient harm. And if we can put that over in front of FDA, we'd like to think that maybe it would strengthen our case, and they might be more inclined to take enforcement discretion. But right now, it's not looking great.
Yeah, unlike the previous issue we talked about the NISA report, which hasn't happened, and we can probably, hopefully, change some minds right now. This is already taking place. And that's unfortunate, as I said, because the prices, the ACG, the brand name at the regular pharmacies used to be $110 for 10,000 IUs. Now it's up to $375, and they write quarters everywhere. So people are people that cannot afford, obviously, for IVF, an IVF cycle can cost up to $55,000. And most couples need at least 3 to 4. So it's and unfortunately that's not covered by insurance. So a lot of people, and I think it hasn't really hit the news yet, but it will, because I'm seeing it already in the field.
Let me mention this. I'm sorry to interrupt. There is a missing link here, and it is prescribers. And again, I'm not trying to throw prescribers under the bus. The triad between prescriber and patient and pharmacist is supreme in pharmacy compounding. But prescribers, generally speaking, have not engaged on the HCG issue and have not engaged on the compounded hormone issue. And yet their ability to treat patients is affected by both of these issues greatly. And so I would plead with prescribers to join us in this fight. Frankly, prescribers are perceived as having greater credibility with FDA when they weigh in on these issues. And so to the extent that we can get prescribers joining us, sharing testimonials, interacting with a member of Congress, reaching out with comment letters to FDA, we believe we can be more effective.
Unfortunately, the NASAN report did not include prescribers' input or patients' input, for that matter. They were basically, the whole panel had no experience on compounding and had never, I don't think any of them, I'm assuming, have ever been a patient that uses compounding products. So there was complete disregard for, we're hoping that some Congress members, hey, everybody's up there in age. I'm 63, most of them are over 50. At least men and women there, a few of them are already using compounding. That would be my dream, because there's several there that could probably either use it or benefit from compounding formulations. So that would really bring a human aspect to a congressperson. Hey, your access, because they're people too, will be restricted.
Well, and we do find with members of Congress that many of them don't know what compounded hormones are. I mean, many do, and many surely have family members who are benefiting from those therapies, if not the member of Congress himself or herself. But one of the reasons for the campaign right now is to socialize the issue, so that when FDA does move, and there's a rumor floating around Washington, D.C. right now that FDA may take action on compounded hormones before mid-year. When that happens, we want to already have socialized the issue on Capitol Hill, so that we're not having to educate members of Congress about what it is. They're already primed and they can act.
Yeah, great idea. Thanks a lot for that. Well, last but not least, let's cover the third issue, which is the USP beyond use date proposals. They're on the table now. Hasn't happened yet either. We may, as patients, not have as much input, but like you said, this is something that is going to affect pricing, access, and refill frequency. So tell us a little bit about the USP proposal.
Yeah, and I'll give you a very layman's version of it, because beyond use dates and anything USP does is fairly complex. So the U.S. Pharmacopeia is the agency that sets standards for substances, medical practice, et cetera. There are a couple of chapters of the U.S. Pharmacopeia that relate specifically to compounding. There are actually more than a couple, but two are in question here. Chapter 795 deals with non-sterile compounding. Chapter 797 deals with sterile compounding. A few years back, USP decided that it needed to update those chapters, and they went through a very comprehensive process for getting input, et cetera, updated the chapters and proposed, among other things, restrictions on beyond use dates. A beyond use date on a compounded product has a very specific meaning. It basically means the product cannot be used after this date. It's not like the little label on your gallon of milk that says best if purchased by. No, this is do not use this product after this date. And typically, traditionally, historically, beyond use dates have been based on very real science associated with a particular substance, a particular preparation. Well, what USP proposed was beyond use dates that were severely curtailed, much shorter than has been the norm. And unfortunately, the beyond use dates that they proposed are largely arbitrary. There's no science that USP can point to that says this is the right beyond use date for this preparation. And in fact, beyond use dates are really preparation specific. So something for a compounded hormone, a beyond use date on a compounded hormone would have a very different beyond use date than some medication you were using to treat a veterinary compound, a horse, a puppy, etc. And so our organization and a number of others pushed back. We appealed the proposed chapters. We won the appeal, and that sent USP back to another round of figuring out how to set these beyond use dates. Well, as you mentioned, this is not yet done. The comment period ends March 15th, and we are making a case to USP that they need to remove the arbitrary nature of beyond use dates. And until they can rely on science in setting those dates, they need to set aside the changes that they have proposed. Ultimately, the effect is exactly what you said. Shorter beyond use dates, which is what the USP proposals would mandate. And remember, I said these chapters are adopted by every state in the country. So while USP is not a policy setting body, the effect of their work is that state legislatures and state boards of pharmacy are going to adopt these things, and it becomes the law of the land in effect. So we do not see how patients benefit from these shorter beyond use dates that are somewhat arbitrary. And the result is going to be that the medication is going to have to be prepared more frequently, which means the patient is going to have to come back for more refills. Maybe they get a 60-day or a 90-day refill now. Now they're going to have to come back perhaps as frequently as every 2 weeks, depending on the compounded medication itself. And you got to figure that if the compounder is having to make it more frequently, that it's going to cost more. Not because a compounder is trying to gouge somebody, but because of the very real cost, material cost, overhead cost, et cetera, of preparing that preparation. So we believe this is an access issue, and it's an access issue that USP is proposing that is not rooted in specific science that demonstrates a need for those shorter beyond use dates.
Yeah, and compounders are going to have to spend, like, I heard, what, $30,000 for every testing of every batch, and the batches have to be smaller now.
Some of the sterility testing on some of these substances that USP would require can cost $30,000 and in excess of $30,000. A lot of pharmacy compounders won't be able to do that. And so again, a patient goes without that medication. USP is also proposing limiting batch sizes to 250 units. And typically that would mean that if a compounder has an order for 1,000 units from the range of prescribers that he or she works for, they're going to have to go into the clean room now 4 times where they could have gone in there 1 time. And every time they go in the clean room, you're increasing the opportunity for contamination, for mistakes, et cetera. And I don't get how that's in the interest of keeping the patient safe. And so we're a little perplexed. Again, we think these proposals are well-intentioned. They are not, at this point, rooted in science.
So how do you sleep at night? I tell you, you guys, this is coming from every side. I mean, well, this industry,
I'm always going to have work to do when I get up in the morning. So there's that.
I'm telling you, I really, my job, I hope not only me, there are many advocates out there especially in the hormone field, women and men, thank God, we're getting more loud, but I think we haven't reached yet the critical point, the tipping point of really all of us working as community and the clinicians, like you say, the prescribers, in which we need to raise our voices because what I've seen in my life, obviously, we didn't have a choice back in the days with HIV. We knew that it was that or death, so we were even willing to block traffic and chain ourselves to Wall Street and all this stuff, act up. And we were young, we're in the 20s, and we knew, okay, it's either death or we get shit done. My dream, and maybe I'm naive, that within the next few months we get a higher level of awareness from patients, and most patients are completely clueless this is happening, and from doctors prescribing. Most of them are busy running their clinics and don't know that this is going to impact their bottom line big time, and their access to the patients, and the way they prescribe, and the way they practice medicine. And I still feel like people are half asleep or in denial, or most people don't think they have the power to change, especially against government, against policy makers. And that's where I probably I'm more optimistic, because I've seen it happen before. But we all have to, and we were only a small group of people. We're like the only 1 million people living with HIV in the United States. How many people do you think are benefiting from compounding? How many millions? Have you ever had a number? How many millions?
And compounded preparations are probably certainly less than 10% of all the prescriptions out there, and yet there are millions of Americans who benefit from these therapies.
Yeah. Well, thanks a lot, Scott. Remind people once again the websites and where to go to take action.
Yeah, the important one is compounding.com. You'll learn all you care to know about the threat to compounded hormones. You can read the testimonials, you can leave a testimonial, but most importantly, you can send a message. And we've pre-written it, but you can edit it any way you want and send a message to your members of Congress to alert them to this threat, so that when FDA does take action, we've got members of Congress who are ready to go to FDA and push back.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for raising awareness. And I really hope everybody watches this video. I'm going to include all the links in the description on the YouTube channel, so people can just click and take action right away. Thanks a lot, Scott, and keep up the good work and the optimism. So there's a lot in front of you and a lot in front of us. So thank you.
You are very kind. Thanks for having me.
You take care.